Do you remember the story of Church in the Vine from Edmonton, Alberta, and specifically the story of the pastors there, Tracy Fortin and her husband, Pastor Rodney Fortin? I only wish I had met these two under better circumstances and not because of extreme Alberta government overreach and a complete and total disrespect for their religious freedom, because, frankly, they're some of the nicest people I've ever met in my entire life. And so very brave. You can learn more about their story and sign my petition and support my billboard along the side of Alberta's busiest highway in support of Pastor Tracy and her congregation at savepastortracy.com. Now, these two, the Fortins, and their church, Church in the Vine, in Edmonton, Alberta, were smashed with an $80,000 fine for refusing to allow health inspectors into their church during worship services. And astoundingly, the Crown Prosecutor wanted the fines to be even larger. I sat through their entire trial. I heard testimony of an Alberta health inspector who admitted to trying to talk to Rodney while he was preaching on the pulpit. I heard testimony about a special task force of Edmonton police, bylaw, and health inspectors who were just scurrying around Edmonton area churches, including entering into the children's room at Church in the Vine to inspect for COVID compliance. And that's when Tracy said enough is enough, and she made it her job as a pastor to protect the sanctity of the worship services from the state. You see, it's not the Church in the Vine were refusing health inspectors access to the church to check for COVID compliance. They just didn't want inspectors inside the services while people were praying and worshiping and singing. Tracy offered to let the inspectors come in before and after services, but they never came. Now, earlier in the summer, a judge in Edmonton convicted the kindly Tracy of crimes against the province, I guess, for her polite declining of health inspectors for shooing them away from the door during worship services. And Church in the Vine and Tracy were given that $80,000 fine, including an enormous victim surcharge. I guess the province is the victim here. And they were given just weeks to pay the fine or they would face civil enforcement. Now, thankfully, Pastor Tracy and her church have been supported by the registered Canadian charity, the Democracy Fund, and your tax-deductible donations to fightthefines.com. And they're free to them. Lawyer James Kitchen, who's been working very hard on this case, he's recently filed an appeal of their conviction, and he's also contending that the fines they were given were absolutely way out of whack with sentencing guidelines. So today we're going to talk to James Kitchen for a legal update, and then you're going to see the interview I did with the lovely Fortin duo. I think you're going to walk away from this with the same opinion as me, that it's mind-boggling, the resources that were spent to punish these two, and the crushing fines against them are insane. All they did was their pastoral duty to keep the state out of their congregants' relationship with God. Okay, but first, here's James Kitchen.
So we've done an appeal to the Court of Queen's Bench. Matters like this, offense matters like this, always start in the provincial court. Because they're just tickets, right? Really. I mean, ultimately the fines were $80,000. They were extreme, but they started as, tickets. And so they start in the provincial court. We appeal to the Queen's Bench, and then we could potentially appeal to the Court of Appeal in Alberta. So there's 3 levels. So we're at the Court of Queen's Bench, and I've alleged several grounds of error by the judge at the trial level, at the provincial court level, 2 errors going to conviction, and then multiple errors going to the sentence of the $80,000. So for the actual conviction, I alleged that the judge was biased, or at least that there's a reasonable apprehension of bias. Bias has 2 parts. You can allege actual bias or reasonable apprehension of bias. I have no evidence of actual bias, but reasonable apprehension of bias insofar as the judge seemed really hyper-focused, almost obsessed with COVID, and to the point that she just failed to see or was willfully ignorant of the religious freedom aspect of the case, which is really what the case is actually all about, right? She kind of skirted around what the case is actually about to make it about something it isn't actually about. So I allege bias in that, which is a pretty significant thing. And then I also allege that she made an error of law by doing exactly what I said, by dismissing summarily the Church in the Vine, their charter arguments about freedom of religion. Right, because that's an error of law, such that if she dismisses on the other hand, we don't even get to argue them in the case, which is what the case is all about, which is Church in the Vine's primary defense. We didn't get to do any of that at the trial level. So we're going to the Court of Appeal to appeal those. And then I have a number of grounds on the sentence as well. Even if we lose, the sentence shouldn't be $80,000. It should be more like $10,000 max.
Yeah, I mean the fines are just so out of whack with the other fines that people who have refused entry to an inspector, what they've experienced. This felt overly punitive, and frankly, the Crown wanted like $250,000.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, that's just kind of where we're at now, right? With COVID, it's just, and again, that goes back to what I think is a reasonable apprehension of bias on the part of the judge, right? She worked up this this thing about COVID, about the church was so awful, what they did was so risky. They did it with complete disregard, et cetera, right? And that's how you work yourself into saying, well, this has to be $80,000 in fines, right? That's the problem, right? We don't seem to be able to have a neutral, objective, sort of sober look at what really happened, right? I mean, if you deny a health inspector in 2019, okay, it's an offense, one for which you should be fined, and there are cases of people being fined. They're like $250, $500. Makes sense, right? It is something to fine. It is something that's wrong, but it's not something that it's not like we're a corporation spewing, oil into some waterway. It's going to take half a millennium to clean up. That's not what it is, right? But that's how it's being treated. That's how it's being compared to, as if it's morally, it has moral fault to it, that is on that level, and then also that the damage to society is on that level, right? You have to get to that in order to have those kind of fines, and that's the problem with COVID, is we've been dislodged from our grasp of reality, right? Because COVID has been turned into something it's not in our minds, and that causes us to lash out at people that we disagree with in society, and we see it even at the most sober of institutions, or what are supposed to be the most sober of institutions, like the courts. Because this is what happens when culture and society becomes unhinged about an idea and infiltrates even the most sober and sacred of our institutions, and people just get crapped on when they shouldn't. We see this with the unvaccinated thing, right? People are treated like second-class citizens. And now we have Christians who, won't follow the rules, treated like second-class citizens at every level of society. This is what happens.
Yeah. I mean, this is what happens when you have convinced yourself that these people, by virtue of just not turning away congregants, they are grandma killers. This is where you get with that rhetoric. You get to an $80,000 fine. Now, speaking of that $80,000 fine, they've paid it because they were under threat of civil forfeiture, civil enforcement here. So they could have lost their home or their car. So they've had to pay that in the interim while they await the appeal.
Yes, but as we know from the Pulaski case, if they were to win and the fine is reduced, they'll get that money back.
Thank goodness the Fortins have a fighter like James Kitchen on their side. And it's only possible through your generous donations to fightthefines.com. Now, amazingly, miraculously, the Fortins were able to pay that fine just in the nick of time. And hopefully, if James Kitchen is successful with his appeal, they'll be able to have that money refunded back to them. But it really was pay the fine or lose everything. So let's hear from Tracy and Rodney. So, Pastor Rodney, Pastor Tracy, I wanted to catch up with you about your case. I know that you have paid the $80,000 fine as you're waiting for your appeal to wind through the Alberta court system. That's a lot of money to come up with in a very short amount of time. They actually didn't give you all that long. I think it was about 90 days.
60 days. It was 2 months that they gave us. I was reading a trial recently where they have 7 years to pay a lesser fine than we have. So it's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, it is.
Well, and I was amazed at how people stepped up to the plate, how many people responded and came up, because the truth is people that believe in what we're doing and the fight that we're fighting. And so it was amazing to see $80,000 come in to fight this. And so we're really thankful for the donors, the people that stood behind us in this so much. We just want to thank them.
A lot of them we know, but a lot of them we don't know. We had donations coming in from all over the world. Some of them were relatively small, but you know what? Every single one contributed, and we're very grateful, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, never discount a small donation. I always think of the story of the widow's mite.
Yeah, that's so true. And you know what? It doesn't matter how big or how small. Yeah, everything adds up, and we were able to walk in there on the date provided and pay the fine. So we're grateful for that.
And if you hadn't paid that fine, the province would have enacted civil enforcement on you. They might have taken your house, maybe your car. That's a huge thing hanging over your head. And really, at the end of the day, it's not that you denied access to Alberta health inspectors to your church. You denied them access during church services. That's really, according to the province, that's your crime here.
That is exactly right. We gave plenty of opportunity for the Alberta Health Inspector to come literally any other day of the week. We would have made arrangements. We offered that more than once, but she insisted that it had to be during the worship service between 8 and 2 o'clock on Sunday. And we simply would not allow our religious gathering to be disrupted in such a horrible way.
Yeah. When I heard testimony that cops and health inspectors were wandering through the service, they were trying to talk to you when you were preaching, and they went into the children's room too, which is a huge violation because you have to take additional steps to protect children when they're in the church.
We do, yeah. We have a plan to protect policy, which limits things like this. We have policies and protocols in place that are really important. And yeah, they're violating protocols. They're basically causing us to infringe upon those protocols by having them there. And so we didn't want them to disrupt that. And, we've just really tried to be integrous through this whole thing with them, but they really made it hard,
Now, you were given an $80,000 fine, but the Crown initially asked for something outrageous. Like it was 120? Yeah, 120. I think if they initially wanted the maximum, it was approaching like a $1.8 million for your church. Why do you think, though, they slapped you with an $80,000 fine? Because it is so out of whack with what we've seen for other places that deny a health inspector entry.
Well, there's only one reason why she would have done that, and that was to make an example of us, to disincentivize us from breaking the mandates again, and to disincentivize other people that were following our story from not obeying the mandates as well.
The part that really gets me is the idea of the victim surcharge that was added. I think,
who's the victim?
Yeah, that's right. Who's the victim? I mean, the real victims are the ones that they persecuted on a regular basis. Us. I think they should have given us the victim surcharge after we paid it, just give it back to us. But $16,000 with no victims, and even the judge herself, she said that there were no victims, but this is something that they impose, and it just didn't make any sense at all to me.
One of the things that came out in testimony was also that you never had an outbreak associated with your church, but they targeted you as though you were a super spreader event.
I did read the transcript from the trial. It's very lengthy, but I read it, and you're right, she did. She came right out and said, although there is not one confirmed case associated with your church, not even an outbreak, not even one case confirmed, she felt the need to come down really hard because of our grievous actions.
Now, one of the things that I have found most appalling in the treatment of lockdown skeptics, lockdown resistors, and I wouldn't even call you that. I would call you people who are obedient to God's law above man's law when man's law conflicts with what God tells you to do. It's the treatment of people who maybe are COVID scofflaws, as they say. They treat it as though it's a moral failing. You didn't follow the rules, and so you're a bad person, and you don't care about your community. But you obviously care about your church community so much so that you would keep the government out of it for at least an hour while you're saying services.
Yeah, we love our community. We love the church as well as the community at large. And, we would never put anybody in harm's way. The truth is we had many different protocols that we followed, that they were even unaware of or that they would even count or consider. They just kept looking for something else. But the reality is we love our people. And so we did everything we possibly could to keep them safe. And as a result, we didn't lose one on our watch. And, I mean, there were things that were going on inside the community and everything, and of course, people were panicking, but inside our house was full of peace, full of joy, and full of love, and we continued to love one another. The Bible says, for you who knows what's right to do and don't do it, for you it's sin. And so for us, we knew what was right, and that was to stay open, that was to continue to gather, to continue to meet with our people and love them and encourage them. And if we did anything else, we felt like we would be violating the greater law, which would be the law of love, or ultimately the law of God. And so we just couldn't do that.
And your church grew because of it.
It did grow a little bit, because you talk about loving our church, our body. Our body definitely grew, because we didn't simply only welcome those who were part of our body before, but our doors were open to anyone and everyone that needed a place of refuge, a place to come where they didn't feel ostracized or hated or alone. We were a place of refuge. It was safe, it was peaceful, it was loving, and people needed that even more during the last couple of years than ever before.
A place of normalcy. I know when Ezra came with me to Grace Life, he said if you weren't Jewish, he would want to come to a place like that, because it was like, as he says, the before times, where people were hugging, singing, talking to each other. You could see their faces. And having him fly out from Toronto to experience that, it was like going back in time. And your church is like that too.
Yeah, like why should things change? I mean, you go out into the community now, you go to the grocery store, and people are still avoiding one another, and people are still wearing masks. I don't get this, and let them do what they want to do. Wear 3 or 4 if you want, but the truth is I'm finding out in the community, people are still trying to stay away from one another. So we've created a culture by virtue of this whole pandemic, if they want to call it pandemic. Anyways, we've created a culture of distance. When in the church,
And isolation.
Yeah, we can't be isolated and distance in the church. We're to love one another. I mean, the greatest thing. I mean, what happened to greet one another with a holy kiss? I know that might be extreme to some people, but according to the Bible, that's what they would do. They would hug one another, love one another. And if that culture's changed because of the dictates of what the world is saying, then we're not following the plan of God. And I think that as a church, as a pastors, we need to continue to encourage love, encourage people to embrace one another, and we can't do it.
Like you said, even at the beginning, it seemed as though we were just saying no, no, no to the government, to the mandates. It really wasn't about that at all. When it came to the crossroads where it was one or the other, we simply could not please both. So we chose to say yes to God and to the mandate that's on our lives personally and on our church.
Even in the language you use to describe your church and your community, you call it the body of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so for you to cut out, as the government asks you to do, 85% of the congregation.
Cut off your arms and legs?
Exactly my
Wow.
point.
You can't cut off your arms and legs and continue to be a healthy body.
You can't. It's interesting. Jesus said, what you did to the least of these, my brothers, my brethren, you did to me. Jesus said, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. When we had people coming in that were hungry, that were looking for something to drink, they were looking for life, they were looking to have something imparted to them. And we didn't refuse that. And I feel like the greatest thing we did through this whole thing is we gave our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, a big hug. And for me, that's the greatest thing I can do as a man of God, is to love people and to allow Jesus to touch them. Because when I touch them, it's actually I'm actually bringing Christ to them. And when I did that, I actually pleased him. And so that's the heart of God here.
One of the things I notice about you two is your just calm optimism about everything. I remember when you guys got your $80,000 fine, you just stepped outside, you had a quick prayer with your supporters and said, it's going to be fine. And it was. You were able to crowdfund your fines, and your appeal is being crowdfunded also, but you just sort of said, this is what, I guess, if you are being persecuted for your faith, it doesn't really matter, because that's what they're doing to you, and you still have to do what you need to do.
we know we're in good company when it comes to being persecuted. I mean, this hardly qualifies as persecution.
Exactly.
But by Canadian standards, this is persecution, and we're in good company. We consider it an honor.
Yeah, and you know what the word says, consider it all joy when you face various trials and tribulations, right? Because they produce in us, it's really essentially when these things are happening, it produces a far greater weight of glory. And that word weight is actually an authority to walk with God among men. They need to see our light today. The world is dark, and the world needs to see light. It needs people who will be, I guess in a sense, I want to just call it like almost like superheroes in our day. They need people to rise up and be better than what's going on in the world. And we're really responding to that challenge to be better, to be a light.
And people are starting to have their eyes opened.
Yeah.
They are. They're starting to see the reality of what has taken place in the last couple of years. And you preached a really great message. You can find it on our website archives if you want to hear it, where he talked about when people start to wake up and realize they're going to be looking for those people who stood. For those bold, courageous people that stood out and were different and didn't blend in with everybody else, because who wants that? They're a dime a dozen.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. When people come out of their wokeness. Because the
When-
truth is,
when the
people are going to
scales
wake
fall
up.
from their eyes.
Yeah, when people wake up, come out of their wokeness, all of a sudden, what they're going to notice, they're not going to notice the people that blended in. They're going to notice the people that stood out. And they're going to say, well, boy, that seems to really contrast, the difference between light and dark again. Like we're called to be a city on a hill, and we're not to be hidden. When you go into the city, into Edmonton, let's say you're driving from several kilometers out, you can see the glow of the city, and it's beautiful, it's drawing, it's luring. And I believe that glow of the city is what draws people to the church. It's what draws people to Christ ultimately. They need to see that glow, that difference.
It is
And that's what she's getting
enticing.
at.
It is. It's enticing. And people are realizing that warmth, the warmth glow, and they're being drawn.
Now, do you two, and I'm sure you do, have a message to everybody who's followed your case so closely, who donated to cover the cost of your fines, and who continued to donate to offset your legal costs, to cover the cost of your great lawyer, James Kitchen? He's so thorough. Do you have a message for your supporters out there?
Goodness, thank you just doesn't seem to be enough. But I guess what I would say is every penny is a partnering penny.
Yeah.
It's a partnership. That's our whole philosophy of life and ministry. When we send money, for example, to a cause, we have a vested interest in that cause.
Right.
And so we feel like we get to partner with the outcome of that cause. And so every penny that has come and that will continue to come is partnering with what we're doing, partnering with the greater cause. Because this isn't about COVID.
No.
Right? This isn't about COVID or mandates. It's not about anything in the here and now. There's a bigger picture here. Mm-hmm. So to all of our partners, we just say thank you.
Yeah, that's so good. As you know, maybe our viewers don't know, but we've got our appeal coming up it's actually happening on Tracy's birthday. We get to go in and be in court on her birthday. So we're, in some ways we're excited about it because we get to be part of actually changing a nation. We get to be part about bringing a solution and a change. There's a lot of people that talk about change, maybe at armchair critics or Facebook armchair critics or whatever, but we get to actually be part of it. And so, like Pastor Tracy was saying, we're grateful to partners that would actually be not just armchair, but that would actually get in the fight with us. So I want to encourage you, just if you haven't stepped in yet and you want to be part of it, man, fight the fines. Let's go for it. Let's do it together.
Premier Jason Kenney is gone, and I think it's largely because of his government's treatment of people like Tracy and Rodney, because while Alberta is on the rebound economically, that's not good enough. There are plenty of horrible places in this world where you can have economic wealth, but no religious freedom. Alberta was never to be one of those places, but it was for a time under Premier Kenney. The persecutions of pastors and lockdown resistors may even last longer than Kenney's reign as premier. I think there must be amnesty for this province to heal and move on. If you believe that the next leader of the United Conservative Party, and therefore The next premier of this great province must grant amnesty for people who chose their civil liberties over following nonsensical COVID rules. Please go to savepastortracy.com. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid. The province of Alberta has unlimited resources to go after nice people like Tracy and Rodney, whose only crime, as best as I can see, is protecting the sanctity of their worship services from the invasion of Alberta Health Services inspectors. But thankfully, Pastor Tracy and Rodney have you on their side. If you would like to help fund their appeal of their conviction and sanctions, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to fightthefines.com.